Olá, pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindos a uma Biblioteca do Consta muito especial. Hoje eu vou ter a honra de entrevistar o General McChrystal. Ele é autor do livro Team of Teams, que é um livro simplesmente imperdível. Primeira vez que eu escutei falar desse livro foi de alguém muito próximo de mim, que é do mundo corporativo, que é CFO de uma empresa muito grande no Brasil. E ele me disse: Rodrigo, esse livro mudou a minha visão aqui na empresa. Uma outra vez que eu soube desse livro, que eu tive contato, foi quando eu recebi minha medalha de honra ao mérito Tamandaré, da Marinha do Brasil, agora, há pouquinho tempo, em Washington, e eu estou lá na sala do presidente, né, local, e eis que eu me deparo com o livro Team of Teams, do general McChrystal. Então, sem mais delongas, eu vou trazer o general para um breve bate-papo sobre esse livro, repito, imperdível. Hi, General. Nice
How are you
to have
today?
you here. Thank you very much for that honor.
It's my honor to be here.
Thank you very much, General. So let me start with the first and obvious question about your great book. How can you train Leviathan, as you mentioned, I guess, yourself? How can you train a Leviathan to improvise, to adapt, to be agile and to the most powerful military forces in the world were just facing a very hard time against Al Qaeda. And you were able to adapt, to manage, to change that reality. How was that possible?
Well, when I talk about it now, it can sometimes sound easier than it actually was. So I'd ask all of our listeners to understand this actually was a very difficult process. The first thing we had to do was accept the fact that we were failing in our mission. We were losing to Al Qaeda in Iraq. And as we tried to figure out why we were losing, why an organization that we were better trained than, we had better equipment, we think we had a much better cause. But on the battlefield, in that environment, they were being successful. And we finally realized that what had happened is they had taken modern information technology, computers, cell phones, and they had changed how they operated as an organization. They stopped using the traditional pyramid-shaped hierarchy. They started to operate with extraordinary flexibility and speed. And while we thought at first that that would be disorganized, in fact, they were able to achieve tremendous focus on the areas that they wanted to operate. So what we really had to do was make the admission that we were losing, understand that we had to do whatever it took to win. And part of that involved becoming more like the enemy. We had to be willing to step away from the habits of the military that I had grown up in. We had to step away from the processes that we had followed that were strict chain of command, tight discipline. And it doesn't mean that we weren't as committed to the fight. It meant that we decided that we were going to share information much more aggressively. We were going to push decisions down to the lowest possible level. And of course, that's counter to what we'd grown up with in the military. So it took a little bit of courage to change.
Okay, sorry, just click it here. All right, so you need to be humble to have a very strong, powerful military force under you and still accept the reality, the tough reality that you were losing. And also to learn some lessons from the enemy who seems much weaker. And I guess one important thing to make that change is to trust your people, to trust the people beneath your command. Is that correct?
You have to give trust and you have to build trust in you. So as you deal with your team, you've got to make it a real goal that people are willing to operate on a handshake, on a word, not on a written document like an operations plan. Otherwise, you couldn't be fast enough.
All right, I understand that. And how is it possible to use all that experience you accumulated in the military forces and the fights against Al Qaeda in the corporate environment? Because your book is very important for the military forces. As I mentioned in Portuguese as an introduction, I found this book in the Brazilian Navy here in Washington. So they all read your book. But also, I heard for the first time about your book in the corporate world. So it's very important as well for CEOs, for CFOs, and all levels of management. So, how is it possible to use those lessons in the corporate world?
Well, it is tempting to look at what we describe in the book as being a military experience. But in reality, it was an organizational experience in a new complex environment. The same environment that corporations and other organizations have to operate in today. It's faster, it's more complex, it's more difficult or sometimes impossible to predict what's going to happen next. And so organizations which have typically been built for earlier industrial age processes and a slower environment have got to shift to adapt to this new environment. For 12 years, we've been working with civilian corporations from hospitals to schools to manufacturers. And in every case, the lessons that we bring turn out to be appropriate for the environment they face now.
But how can you manage to be flexible, to be more bottom up than top down approach, than Taylor or Ford, and at the same time have the compliance and the certainty that in all those team within the teams, you're gonna follow the spirit of the group and the goals of the company?
We would say that the key aspect is shared consciousness. And what I mean is, in previous times, senior people in an organization could give detailed instructions down to somebody to do something, and those people didn't have to understand the entire operation. Now what we want to do is push down authority and accountability to the lowest possible level, but that means we've got to give them the information. We've got to share information that used to be kept only at the higher levels so that at the lower levels, they have this contextual understanding and they can understand we're trying to solve a certain problem. And they shouldn't necessarily do exactly what we told them to do. They should do whatever helps solve the problem. Now, that requires a little courage on the part of leaders because you're empowering your people. But ultimately, it's faster and it just works better.
And in terms of returns in the investments of the company, in growing and all that, you think if they adopt these strategies and this mindset, because it's a kind of a change of a culture. So if they do that, you think they're going to achieve the good results that you were able to see in the military. And you've also seen that kind of results, good results in companies as well, right?
Absolutely. And we call it return on investment. And so when we started this, before we changed in my counterterrorist force, we were doing 4 operations a month. That was our key metric. 2 years later, by changing, we were doing 300 operations a month with the same force, the same technology. What we did was we changed how we operated and we unlocked capacity that we didn't think. We see the same thing in civilian corporations. It speeds it up, it makes it more precise, and people closer to the problem who understand it better make the key decisions.
And one thing that it's important is that you change your strategy because you were losing, as you said. You needed to face reality, the tough reality, that in spite of the power of the American military forces, you were losing. But is it a good strategy for winning companies as well to change because, or to give this approach to the teams? Because success sometimes it's not sustainable. I mean, we live in a very flexible environment. the world has been changing very fast, quickly. So I guess it would be important for companies, even successful companies that are winning so far, to have this in mind. The success cannot last forever if they don't adapt quickly to the new environments, correct?
I think we only need to look at the history of companies. If you go back 40 years, companies that were at the top of business tended to stay there for decades. Now they tend to stay there for much shorter periods. And so companies cannot be static. Just because you are successful doesn't mean you will be. And every company that doesn't change is doomed to be beaten by its competitors. The environment will simply take away the advantage that you have. And so I would argue it's not an option, it's a requirement.
Yeah. Adapt quickly or die. And
Exactly.
General, one more question for the Brazilian public, because I'm pretty sure they're going to be very interested in your book, in your lessons. Does it depend on the culture? Like I live in the United States for 8 years almost now. I can see that things are different. I knew that already. I've been writing about it for a while. But some lessons are like forever, and it doesn't depend a lot in what kind of culture you're in. So is your book important for every culture, for every company, for every structure around the world?
I think it is, because the environment affects every culture. Our opponents in Iraq were a Muslim people from Iraq for the large part, with some foreign fighters, and yet they essentially utilized these techniques with extraordinary success. We have operated around the world since I left the military with corporations, and we found in every case it has to be customized for the operating environment you're in, for the culture you're working with, but the basic principles are absolutely the same everywhere.
Yeah, we have the human nature, and it doesn't change
No.
when you fly around. Okay, General, thank you very much for your time. I know you have a very busy schedule, so thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it, and I'm pretty sure the Brazilian public will love your book. Thank you very much, General.
My honor. Thank you, Constantino.